Okay, and last but not least, we have tropical substrate. Not a lot of species will need something like this, but just in case you may be keeping something that's not a snake, maybe some geckos or maybe some other types of reptiles, amphibians, this is great for that. This is great for rainbows. I mean, this is great for terrestrial snakes or even fossorial snakes like files. This will definitely get the job done. Like, this shit will hold water like the Chattahoochee. So first step with this, and I guess I should preface this by mentioning, because this substrate is meant to hold a lot of water, two things need to happen. It needs to dissipate slowly over time. That is the most important. And this is definitely a substrate you want to use if you're in a very dry climate and you need a very humid animal, or have a very humid animal, I should say. It needs to dissipate water slowly over time, but quick enough where the soil doesn't get bogged down. This is important, and two things help facilitate this. The first thing, obviously, is the substrate mix with all of these ingredients. On top of that, you also need to make sure that there is plenty of ventilation in your enclosure, which I know is counterintuitive to what most people are taught about high humidity species. But as long as you are mixing a substrate that is helping to facilitate very high amounts of moisture, even with greater ventilation than what someone may typically use, you will still have tons of humidity. So let's get started. Each ingredient, pea pebbles again. I think you guys understand why I'm using this by now. Again, to reiterate, this is to help aerate your soil. This makes sure that your soil is not packed down. If you have a heavier bodied snake, this helps make sure that water is still dissipating, that CO2 and ammonia is still escaping as it needs to, and then it's appropriately ventilated outside of the enclosure with appropriate amounts of ventilation. I think this is roughly about the same, or the amount that I use. I might use... All right, next up, orchid bark. This very well could just be in the whatever soil that you choose to use, but orchid bark is really good because it helps with drainage. This is really good for deep rooting plants, especially in a tropical environment that love a lot of water but need a lot of drainage. And that's also where the pebbles come in. You know what? All right. But that's what orchid bark, and that's where the pebbles come in. This stuff will be sure and make sure that when you have tons of water and you have plants that need tons of water, at least all at once, you still have the ability to dissipate that water away from the roots once the plant is done absorbing all that it needs to absorb. I didn't touch on this before, but I guess it's an appropriate time to touch on it now because I'm sure many of you are asking, James, what about a drainage layer? I don't necessarily use drainage layers. I haven't in quite a while, actually. I just make sure that my substrate allows for, it allows for evaporation. If my substrate can't evaporate water, a drainage layer is pretty much useless anyway. And most people, the argument against drainage layers for some people may be, oh, drainage layers just get moldy. Well, of course they do, because most people still aren't using the appropriate substrate to make sure that the drainage layer can actually do its job. More or less, substrate, drainage layer, it's an aquifer. And if you know what that is, it's an area where water collects, usually deep. There might be more sediment. There might be pockets, and basically what needs to happen is that your substrate needs to be aerated enough to allow all of that moisture from a heavy rainfall to actually evaporate, to get through the soil and evaporate as it needs to. This will help with that. Pebbles will help with that. So, in you go. Next up, sphagnum moss, because we got to make this thing as hydrophilic, not phobic this time, as hydrophilic as possible. Peat moss again, because it'll do the same thing and it'll add nutrients to the soil. We won't go through that again. And then we have horticulture charcoal, because this does help with all of our microorganisms. Actually, I might add a little bit more. There we go. All right, and that's pretty much it. Play sand again. I think for this, it comes down to where you are. I would say for this, play sand is optional. The thing with play sand at this point is that it's more important now for your soil to aerate than the other two substrate options. And that more or less means that if you do use sand, and if the sand does end up sinking to the bottom because it's denser than all the other ingredients, it will cause two things to occur. The roots, where the plants are, if you choose to use plants, this is for plant users, for planted bioactive users, it will pull water away from those roots. On top of that, it's also going to block water from dissipating away from that level, even if you have a drainage layer, or especially if you have a drainage layer, actually. And that's what you don't want. So if the sand is equally distributed between the substrate, it's not an issue. If the sand, for any reason, starts to tumble towards the bottom of the substrate, now it becomes a problem. So it's optional for people who live in drier climates. It's optional specifically for people who want to use planted bioactives at this point. And then I will mix and we'll be right back. Should look pretty familiar. Other than a couple other ingredients that we've added, it should look roughly the same as your subtropical. It'll hold water similarly, but in this case, it holds water a lot better. Perfect. Beautiful. So that's more or less, make sure that actually went down. Yeah, it did. So that's more or less everything. There's a lot more stuff I probably could have added, but I don't want this video to be super long, because it easily could be. But that's more or less everything that you need to know, at least is all the important stuff I think you need to know about mixing substrates. This is more or less about bioactive and more so about substrates that will definitely help you as a keeper in the long term and your snake in the long term, whatever their humidity needs may be. I know that humidity is a bitch and a half for a lot of people, especially people who live in arid environments, people who are going into very cold winter environments, who have to run a heater in their house, or their central heating may just blow. This is for you. This is not just for people that want to go bioactive. This is also for people who want to maintain humidity when it gets really dry and they're just struggling with it completely, and they don't want to pull their hair out anymore. But yeah, I'm probably going to type up something underneath this video to make sure everybody has a decent understanding so they can read it and then they can also see it if they don't want to hear me ramble on about this shit. So yeah, thanks for watching.